The kingdom of Veilwatch lay under a permanent eclipse, and the sky above it never showed true day again. Broken towers stood like black teeth over empty roads, while demon-forged ruins glowed faintly in the dust. Long ago, this land had a throne, a court, and a proud royal line, but now only silence remained, broken by wind, ash, and the soft sound of things that should not move. The people who still lived in the outer farms kept their doors locked at dusk, because they feared the wraiths that drifted across the roads whenever royal blood was near. In a hidden valley beyond the dead capital, a young exile named Eira tried to live unseen, even though her face carried the mark of the line that had once ruled all of Veilwatch. Eira was a woman with pale skin, gray-blue eyes, and long silver-white hair that she tied back with a dark ribbon. She wanted only a quiet life because the court had cast her out when she was still young, and she had learned that power only brought pain. But the kingdom was failing deeper each season, and that made her matter more than she understood. One night, the old ruined bell near her home rang by itself, and her adopted guardian, a man named Gideon, came running with fear in his voice. Gideon was a man with weathered brown skin, short black hair, and a heavy cloak that hid old battle scars. He had raised Eira after her exile, and he wanted to protect her from the crown, from the ruins, and from the truth of her blood. He told her the worst thing in the kingdom had begun again. The wraiths were gathering, the eclipse was darkening, and the last throne would soon awaken either for salvation or ruin. He also told her that a blade had been kept in the old crypt below the valley, and that it had been sealed for one reason. It could not be drawn by a living hand unless Eira stood apart from her own shadow. That strange rule had guarded the weapon for years, because the blade was made in the age when the abyssal monarch first tried to rise from beneath the capital crater. If the wrong person drew it, the curse would spread through the land like poison. But if the right bloodline claimed it, the sword might cut the chains of the fallen world. Eira did not want any part of that burden. She wanted to run, hide, and forget the name of her family. Yet when the first wraith reached the valley gate and lifted its hollow face toward her, she saw that hiding was no longer possible. The crypt beneath the valley was cold, narrow, and lined with stones that seemed to sweat black dust. Gideon carried a lantern, and Eira followed him with a shaking hand on the wall. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal of cracked marble, and on it rested a sword wrapped in dark cloth. The air around it felt wrong, as if the room itself feared being touched. Gideon explained the blade in plain words because he knew fear would not help if the truth stayed hidden. The sword had been forged from Eclipse metal, a rare material pulled from the ruins after the kingdom fell. It had been sealed by the last queen, Eira's mother, because the sword answered only to separation. The queen had believed the curse was a lock, not a punishment. She had hoped one day a child of her blood would learn how to use it. Eira stared at the cloth, and then the room went still. Her shadow moved first, slipping away from her feet and stretching across the stone floor like a living thing. It rose behind her, standing upright in the lantern light, and Eira stepped back in shock as the shape of herself looked at her with empty silver eyes. The cursed blade woke at once. The cloth fell away, and the sword left the pedestal by its own pull, sliding free only when her shadow opened a path. Gideon watched with fear and relief together because the old rule had been true. The weapon was real, the curse was active, and Eira was the one chosen to carry it. Then the valley roof shook as the wraiths broke through the outer stones. Their bodies were thin and gray, their faces smooth and broken at the same time, and they moved with hunger toward the royal blood in Eira's veins. Gideon shouted for her to run, but Eira stood frozen until her shadow raised the sword before her. That was the first time she understood something important. The blade was not waiting for strength, it was waiting for courage. Eira fled into the wasteland beyond the valley, and the world opened into ash fields, broken roads, and ruins that looked half-grown from stone and half-carved by demons. The wraiths hunted her from the air and from the ground because royal blood gave off a heat they could smell even through dust and stone. Gideon stayed behind to slow them at the valley gate, and though he survived the clash, his warning echoed in Eira's mind. He had said the throne did not sit in the capital anymore. It had sunk beneath the crater when the abyssal monarch was first sealed below it. Now something in that deep place was waking, and every wraith served that hidden ruler. Eira traveled with the sword wrapped at her side, but she could only draw it when her shadow separated. Each time the land shifted under the eclipse, the shadow moved sooner, as if it knew the danger before she did. Along the road she met a scout named Mara, a woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and quick eyes that missed nothing. Mara was a survivor from the ruined border towns, and she wanted food, shelter, and a way to keep her younger brother safe. She also hated the wraiths because they had stolen nearly everything from her village. When she saw Eira with royal marks and a cursed blade, Mara almost ran, but then she saw the fear in Eira's face and understood that this was not a proud queen returning home. This was a girl trying not to break under the weight of a kingdom. Mara chose to help because she knew the wasteland only gave mercy to those who shared what little they had. She told Eira about the Titan bound in black chains across the western plain, a giant guardian left behind from the age of the throne. The old stories said the Titan blocked the path to the cratered capital, and that its chains were not there to hold it down only, but to keep something else from rising. If the Titan ever woke fully, the whole plain could collapse under its steps. Eira listened and felt her chest tighten because every answer only led to a deeper danger. Still, she had no choice but to keep moving. The eclipse was deepening, the wraiths were gathering, and the blade at her side was now the only thing that responded to her fear. By the third night of travel, the wasteland began to change. Black roots pushed through the ground, ruins rose from the dust like bones, and cold lights moved between cracked pillars. Eira, Mara, and the quiet remaining hope in their hearts reached the western plain just as the chains came into view. The Titan stood there like a mountain with a face, its stone skin marked with old runes and long scars from endless restraint. Black chains thicker than trees wrapped around its arms, chest, and neck, each link buried in iron pylons that shone with cursed light. The Titan was not a mindless beast, as many had feared. Its eyes opened slowly, and in them Eira saw sorrow, not rage. A voice rolled across the plain like distant thunder, low and tired, and it asked why the blood of the lost throne had returned. Mara trembled, but Eira stepped forward because the truth had begun to press on her harder than fear. She asked the Titan what was holding it there. The Titan answered that it had been bound by the first kings after they made a bargain with the abyssal monarch below the capital. The kings had promised power, and in return the abyss had given them endless ruin. When the last queen resisted, she hid Eira away and sealed the sword, because she knew the palace had already fallen from within. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Gideon was not the only one who had known the truth. Eira had once heard her mother speak of a hidden chamber beneath the throne room, a place where the abyssal monarch could call to those with royal blood. The monarch did not hunt blood for food. It hunted blood because royal line carriers were the only ones who could open the final seal. Eira had been exiled not because she was weak, but because her mother had saved her from becoming a key in the wrong hands. The Titan then revealed one more terrible truth. The cursed blade was made from the same abyssal metal as the chains. It had been forged to respond to separation, because the old queens feared that a true heir would be tempted to use strength alone. Instead, they built the sword to awaken only when the heir accepted what had been split away. Eira did not fully understand, but she felt the meaning inside her. Her shadow was not a flaw. It was the part of her that had survived the exile, the grief, and the fear. It was the part that could reach into darkness without being swallowed. Before she could ask more, the wraith army rose over the hills behind them, a black tide of hollow faces and reaching hands. The Titan strained against its chains as the ground shook and the plain filled with the sound of cracking iron. Eira took the sword in both hands, and her shadow stood beside her like a second self. For the first time, she did not fear it. She called to it, and the blade came free in a burst of dark light. The chains on the Titan flickered, the wraith stalled, and far beneath the capital crater, something ancient opened one eye and noticed her at last. The path to the throne was no longer hidden, and the eclipse above Veilwatch grew darker still. While Eira stood at the edge of a war she was only beginning to understand. Veilwatch lay under its endless eclipse like a city that had forgotten how to breathe, and the ruined capital sat in the center of a vast crater, silent under broken stone and old ash. Towers leaned at strange angles, empty windows stared into darkness, and cracked roads curved toward the palace like dead rivers. Eira stood at the edge of that broken heart with the cursed eclipse blade in her hands, and she felt the whole place watching her. She was a young woman with pale skin, gray-blue eyes, and long silver-white hair tied back with a dark ribbon, and she looked tired enough to fall over, yet she still held herself straight. Gideon stood close beside her, a middle-aged man with weathered brown skin, short black hair, and a strong build, and he kept his lantern lifted like he could guard her from the whole world. Mara waited a few steps behind them, a young woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and sharp green eyes, with her patched red scarf tight around her neck and her stance low like a fighter ready to move. Eira knew the truth now, at least the part she could see. The blade was real, her shadow could split from her body, and the throne below the crater was no longer hidden. What she did not know was worse. Someone or something had been waiting beneath Veilwatch for her blood, and if she failed here, the wraiths would spread through the last safe roads and the broken kingdom would be swallowed forever. Gideon believed the city still held a seal, Mara believed someone had built a trap, and Eira understood only this much: her royal blood mattered, and that made her a target. The first sign of movement came from the chains wrapped around the Titan of the Western Plain. The massive stone giant stood half-sunk into the ruined ground, its cracked gray skin marked with dim runes, its eyes heavy with ancient sorrow. Black chains crossed its chest and arms, and iron pylons held those chains deep in the earth. When Eira had drawn the blade, the chains had flickered, and now they shivered again as if something inside the Titan had heard her name. Gideon stepped forward, careful and serious, and told her what he knew. Long ago, when Veilwatch still had a living king, the Titan had been chained to hold back the old force buried under the capital. The throne was not a prize, he said. It was a lock. The ruler who sat there had to carry the seal in their blood, or the buried power would wake. Mara crossed her arms and asked the question that had been bothering her from the start. If the Titan was meant to protect the city, then why were wraiths guarding the road, and why did they chase Eira as if she were food? Gideon answered before Eira could. The Wraith army had once been court guards and servants, but the curse hollowed them out, and now they were drawn to royal blood because the blood of the old line could either renew the seal or break it open. That answer made the air feel colder. Eira looked down at the dark sword, and its eclipse patterns pulsed once in her hand, as if the weapon itself was listening. Then the wraiths came again, faster and closer than before. They flowed from collapsed streets and broken arches in a pale wave, thin gray bodies moving with sharp speed, their featureless faces turned toward Eira as if they could smell the blood in her veins. The first rank struck the edge of the crater, and the ground filled with black mist and clashing shadows. Gideon raised his lantern high, and its light spread in a wide ring that pushed several of the spirits back for a moment. Mara moved like she had lived through too many bad nights to panic now. She darted between fallen stones, pulled Eira away from a reaching wraith, and called for her to keep the blade ready. Eira had no plan, only the strange memory of what had happened when she accepted her shadow. The shadow had stood beside her like a second self, and the blade had answered when she no longer fought that part of herself. Now she tried something even harder. She did not run from the darkness at her feet. She let it gather. Her own shadow rose thin and sharp beside her, and the cursed Eclipse blade gave off a cold light that matched the dark shape beside her leg. When she swung, the blade cut through the air with a silence that felt louder than any shout, and the nearest wraiths were forced to retreat in a burst of broken mist. But more kept coming, and each one looked hungrier than the last. The wraiths were not only defending the city, they were driving her toward the center of the crater, toward the throne below, and that made the whole fight feel planned. Mara saw the pattern first because Mara always watched the edges. She called out that the wraiths were making room, not attacking to win, but her words came too late for comfort. A tremor passed under the stone, and one of the iron pylons near the Titan cracked with a sharp, dry sound. The Titan lifted its head a little, and for one impossible second its dim eyes brightened with pain. Then a hidden doorway opened in the ground between the broken palace walls, and cold air rose from below like a breath from a sleeping grave. Gideon stared at the opening and went pale in the lantern light. He said he had seen that lower passage only once, years ago, in old records stolen from the royal archive. It led beneath the throne room to a chamber no living ruler was meant to enter. That was the place where the last king sealed away the source of the curse, or so the records claimed. He had believed the stories were warnings. Now he understood they were instructions. Eira felt anger rise in her chest, not just fear. Someone in the line of her family had known this darkness was real and had hidden the truth from the rest of the kingdom. She asked Gideon who would do that. He answered with a heavy look, a ruler who feared the power below the throne. A ruler who feared that greed, pride, or desperate use of that power would ruin the whole land. That was the first twist, and it landed hard. Eira had thought the throne was stolen from her. Now she saw that it had been buried, guarded, and locked away for a reason. The enemy below was not only waiting, it was patient, clever, and wrapped in the rules of old blood and old fear. They moved through the doorway and down into the buried capital, where the air changed at once and felt older than stone. The walls were lined with cracked reliefs of crowned figures and chained beasts, and every image showed the same story in different forms. A royal hand on a seal, a titan kneeling in chains, a dark shape beneath a throne. Eira kept her fingers tight around the sword, and her shadow stayed close, no longer an enemy but a silent partner that matched her steps. Gideon read the carvings aloud as they passed, and the truth became clearer with every line. The royal family of Veilwatch had not ruled for glory. They had been chosen to hold a gate shut. The throne had been built above a prison, and the bloodline had been used as the key. That explained why the wraiths wanted Eira, and why the buried force had stirred the moment her blade awakened. It was not enough for her to be royal. She had to accept the part of herself that belonged to the seal, the part that could command both light and shadow without breaking. Mara slowed at the next chamber and pointed ahead with one gloved hand. Beyond a broken arch stood a wide hall with a black stone floor, a throne of shattered silver, and a ring of runes glowing under the dust. At the far end of that hall waited a tall figure wrapped in a dark mantle, still and calm, as if it had been expecting guests for a very long time. The shape did not move, but its voice came soft and clear through the cold air. It thanked Eira for arriving at last, and it said the seal had begun to crack. Eira felt her heart sink because the voice was not monstrous or wild. It was patient, thoughtful, and full of purpose. Whatever stood there had made the wraiths, bound the titan, and built the curse into the bones of Veilwatch. It wanted the throne because the throne was the only thing left that could either free it or finish the prison. Eira lifted the cursed Eclipse blade, Gideon raised his lantern, and Mara planted her feet beside them, but all three of them understood the same hard truth at once. The real battle had only just begun, and the dark figure ahead had already planned for this moment long before any of them were born. The hidden hall shuddered, the rune ring brightened, and somewhere below the floor, something ancient answered with a slow and terrible turn. The hidden hall of Veilwatch felt alive with fear, as if the stone itself remembered every oath ever broken there. Broken walls leaned inward, black dust drifted through the air, and the permanent eclipse above sent a cold gray light through cracks in the ceiling. Eira stood in the center of that ruin with the cursed Eclipse blade in her hand, Gideon beside her with his lantern held high, and Mara just behind them with her feet set wide and ready. The dark figure at the far end of the hall did not move away because he did not need to. He had planned for this moment with patient care, and he wanted them to understand that before he struck. His name was Victor, a lean man in a long black coat, with sharp gray hair, pale skin, and eyes that looked almost silver in the lantern light. He was the royal archivist who had helped hide Veilwatch long ago, and he wanted the prison below the palace opened because he believed the titan within could be commanded and used to rebuild the kingdom under his rule. He had spent years studying the old bloodline of the lost crown, and he had waited for a true heir to reach this chamber, because only royal blood could wake the final lock. That was why Eira mattered so much. She had never wanted a crown, but the hidden birthmark near her collarbone marked her as the last living heir, and Victor had built every trap around that one fact. If he won now, the titan would rise fully, the wraith army would spread through the cratered capital, and the last safe path out of Veilwatch would close forever. The floor shook again, and the rune ring around the chamber brightened until every carved line glowed a deep amber gold. A heavy sound rolled up from below, slow and deep, like something vast turning in its sleep. Mara looked down at the cracked stone and muttered that she hated every part of this place, which was her honest way of saying she was afraid and still standing firm. She was a young woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and sharp green eyes, and she had grown up surviving bad roads, bad deals, and worse people. She wanted one thing above all else now, and that was to keep Eira alive long enough to make her own choice. Gideon, a middle-aged man with weathered brown skin, short black hair, and a strong build, tightened his grip on the lantern handle. He had become their shield because he knew what evil looked like when it came wrapped in old laws and patient lies. His lantern was not just a light. It held a pale flame touched by temple glass, and that flame could weaken the shadow mist around the chamber when he focused his will. Victor lifted one hand and smiled without warmth. He said the prison was not a prison at all, but a gate. Long ago, the first rulers of Veilwatch had bound the titan of the western plain beneath the cratered capital because the giant would not kneel to any king. The king before the fall feared the titan would crush the whole kingdom if it was left free, so the royal line sealed it with Eclipse stone and chained it with iron pylons. Victor had learned that the true danger was not the Titan itself, but the greed of those who wanted to control it. He also knew the cursed Eclipse blade had been forged from the same Eclipse stone and could either cut the seal cleanly or shatter it into chaos. That was why he had spent so many years protecting the blade from the wrong hands, while secretly preparing to take it for himself. Eira did not answer Victor at first. Her gray-blue eyes stayed on the blade, and she felt its cold weight press against her palm like a warning. She had already learned that the weapon only woke when the user and their shadow were separated, and the hall now gave her exactly that chance. The lantern light behind her cast her shadow forward, while Victor blocked the far side with his own dark shape, splitting the room into pieces. The eclipse patterns along the sword began to glow in thin silver lines, and the air around the blade felt sharp enough to sting. Eira drew a slow breath, remembering every hard mile that had brought her here, from the ash roads outside Veilwatch to the broken walls of the cratered capital. She had once believed she was only a tired traveler searching for a lost history, but now she understood she was carrying the last thread of a fallen royal line. That knowledge did not make her proud, it made her steady. She stepped forward and the rune ring answered with another deep pulse. Victor lifted his hand and two things happened at once. Pale wraith forms seeped through cracks along the far wall, silent and hungry, their thin gray bodies moving with unnatural speed, and the iron chains below the floor gave a violent jerk. The wraith army had no true faces, only broken hollows where eyes should have been, and they drifted toward the heat of royal blood like moths to a flame. Mara swore under her breath and moved to Eira's left side, while Gideon raised his lantern higher and drove a cone of pale light across the first wave of spirits. The light did not destroy them, but it made them recoil and break apart long enough for Mara to throw a hooked chain and knock one creature back into the stone. The fight was not graceful, but it was sharp, fast, and full of desperate purpose. Eira brought the Eclipse blade across her body, and when the sword met the shadow mist, the air flashed cold and white, forcing three wraiths to scatter into the walls. Victor watched all of this with calm delight because every clash only confirmed what he had hoped. He spoke while the chamber trembled and his voice carried above the struggle. He said Eira was not the first heir to stand in that room, and she would not be the last chance if she failed. Then he revealed the deeper truth with a smile that made Mara narrow her eyes. The prison below the throne room had been built around a second lock, and that lock did not guard the Titan alone. It also held a sleeping command seal, one powerful enough to bind the Titan into obedience if the right voice was given at the right moment. Victor had not planned to release chaos, he had planned to rule it. He believed the kingdom had fallen because weak rulers feared strength, and he wanted to prove that only one clever man could hold the broken land together. His logic was twisted, but it was clear, and that made him even more dangerous. Gideon understood it first. He shouted that Victor had already chosen to risk the whole realm just to become its master, and that was not leadership, it was theft dressed as wisdom. Victor answered by striking the floor with a metal rod, and the rune ring flared so brightly that the chamber walls seemed to vanish. From below, the ancient thing turned again, this time with a groan that made every chain in the room shiver. The Titan beneath the floor was waking, and the sound of its movement carried a heavy sorrow that made even the wraith army hesitate. Eira felt the sword in her hand pull toward the center of the room, and she suddenly understood that the weapon was not only a key. It was a judge. The eclipse marks on the blade aligned with the glowing ring, and for a brief instant she saw a memory that was not her own. She saw the first king of Veilwatch standing in the same hall, not with fear but with grief, while the Titan of the Western Plain knelt in chains and looked at him with ancient, tired eyes. The king had not chained the Titan to punish it. He had chained it to stop Victor. The memory hit Eira like a hard blow because it changed everything she thought she knew about the old prison. The Titan was not the enemy that had destroyed the kingdom. It was the thing the kingdom had tried to protect. Victor had uncovered the prison and twisted its history so he could use royal fear for his own gain. Mara saw Eira freeze and grabbed her shoulder, demanding the truth with her eyes. Eira answered in one quick breath, telling them that the Titan was a guardian and that Victor had lied about everything. Gideon did not waste time on surprise. He nodded once because the truth was enough, and he told them they now had to keep Victor away from the second lock before the wrong command could be spoken. The wraith army surged again, this time with greater force, and the chamber filled with drifting black mist. Gideon swung his lantern in a wide arc, carving a path of pale light that pushed the spirits back. Mara darted through the opening fast and low and hurled one of Victor's own metal tools into the rune ring to crack its edge. Eira ran with them, the blade bright in her hand, and the three of them moved as one, not because they trusted fate, but because they had finally chosen each other. Victor's expression changed at last, and for the first time he looked angry. He raised both hands and spoke a command in the old court language, trying to awaken the seal below the floor. The chamber answered with a violent shudder, and one of the iron pylons snapped loose from the stone with a blast of dust. The sound rang through the hall like a bell, and the wraith army screamed without voices, their shapes stretching long in the lantern light. Eira felt her hidden birthmark burn, not with pain but with recognition, and she understood that the prison was listening to the blood of the true line. Victor saw that too. He reached for her with a sudden rush, not to strike her but to seize the blade and force the final command through her hand. Mara blocked him first, slamming her shoulder into his side and driving him back a step. Gideon then stepped between them, lantern blazing, and the light forced Victor to shield his eyes. Eira stood at the edge of the rune ring, breathing hard, while below her the Titan of the Western Plain gave one huge, heavy turn inside its chains. The chamber floor split with a deep crack, and a line of pale stone rose between Eira and the far wall, cutting the hall into two uneven halves. Through the opening, a deep stair of black steps became visible, leading down into a hidden space under the throne room where something large waited in silence. Victor laughed once, but the sound was thin now because he had lost control of the room and he knew it. He said the lower chamber still belonged to him, and he promised that the next seal would not forgive hesitation. Eira lifted the Eclipse blade higher, and the sword answered with a cold glow that cut through the shadow around her face. She no longer looked like a tired traveler. She looked like the last heir of Veilwatch, and she was ready to follow the path below, even though the sound from beneath the floor had just become the first clear voice of the Titan waking in the dark. The battle was not over. It had only found a deeper level, and whatever waited under the throne room was now awake enough to notice them all. The throne room of Veilwatch lay in a heavy silence, while black light from the Eclipse poured through broken stone above them. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and every cracked tile seemed to wait for a bad choice. Eira stood at the edge of the hidden stair, her long silver-white hair tied back with a dark ribbon, her gray-blue eyes locked on the opening below. She was a young woman, tired and wary, yet the sword in her hand had changed her posture in a single breath. Gideon stood close behind her, a middle-aged man with weathered brown skin, short black hair, and a strong frame that looked built for hard days and hard choices. He kept his lantern raised, and the pale flame inside it pushed back the shadow mist that tried to creep over the floor. Mara stood on Eira and Gideon's sides, a young woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her patched red scarf shifted as she leaned forward, ready to run, ready to fight, and ready to argue if the next step looked foolish. Above them, Victor watched from the broken dais with cold silver eyes, his pale face calm, his gray hair neat, and his long black coat moving only a little in the dead air. He wanted the power below for himself because he believed the throne below was his only path back to control, and he would use the kingdom if he had to break it. The danger was simple now. If the prison under the throne room opened the wrong way, the Titan would rise free, the Wraith army would spread through the capital, and Veilwatch would lose the last wall that kept the old darkness inside. Eira did not look away from the stair. The Eclipse blade, a long dark sword with a faint black sheen, gave off a cold glow that made the ruin around her seem sharper and stranger. The blade had answered only after her shadow had been split from her body by the lantern light, and that rule mattered more now than any of them had first guessed. Gideon had explained it in a low voice only moments before. The sword could be drawn when the user and the shadow were separated because the blade fed on broken light and divided truth. That strange rule had sounded like an old warning then, but now it felt like the key to everything. Eira touched the simple wrapped grip more tightly and felt the hidden royal birthmark near her collarbone burn under her tunic, as if her body knew this place better than her mind did. She had spent most of her life as a traveler with no home and no name that mattered, but the blade and the throne room had already started to change that. Beneath her feet, the Titan spoke again in a deep voice that shook the stone. The sound was not angry at first, it was tired, old, and full of sorrow. Mara swallowed hard and looked down the stair. She wanted answers, not legends, because she trusted only what she could see. Gideon wanted to protect the girl in front of him, but he also wanted the truth that he had chased for years in hidden records and sealed halls. Victor wanted them to move first because fear often made people do the work of their enemies. Then a hard noise cracked through the room from the broken side doors, and a cluster of wraiths spilled inside, pale and hollow, their thin gray bodies gliding fast over the floor with black mist trailing from their limbs. They did not speak. They did not hesitate. They moved straight for Eira, drawn by the royal blood in her veins like starving wolves drawn to light. Gideon swung the lantern forward, and the pale flame flashed against the wraiths like a warning bell. The mist around their bodies thinned for a second, and several of them jerked back as if the light had burned their skin without touching it. Mara darted left, fast and low, and drove a broken spear shaft into the floor to trip the first wave, forcing the leading spirits to twist around her path. Eira stepped in at the center, and the Eclipse blade cut a clean arc through the air with a cold, sharp glow. The blade did not slice flesh or spill blood, but it split the shadow around the nearest wraith and drove it backward into the cracked wall, where it collapsed into drifting mist. More came behind it, silent and quick, and the room filled with the hiss of the lantern flame, the scrape of boots, and the heavy tremor from below. Victor smiled then, just once, because he saw the opening he had wanted. He raised one gloved hand and spoke a few calm words in the old royal tongue, and the broken floor under the far dais split wider than before. A black stone seal, hidden for many years, slid aside with a roar of grinding rock. The opening did not lead to freedom, it led to the true prison chamber. Eira saw it all at once and understood the trap. Victor had not come only for power. He had known the prison was close to failing, and he had followed them here so they would awaken it for him. He wanted the Titan to stir, the wraiths to gather, and the royal heir to reveal herself in the chaos. That was when the old memory came, rising like a vision through the blade. The first king of Veilwatch stood in an Eclipse hall, wearing a worn royal robe with muted gold trim, his short dark hair pulled back, his solemn face lit by the same cold light. He looked not like a conqueror but like a man making a terrible choice. His voice entered Eira's head like a dream. He had built the prison beneath the throne room, not to rule the Titan, but to bind it to the kingdom and keep a greater hunger locked away under it. The Titan was the chain, not the curse. The deeper darkness was what the chains had truly protected everyone from. The memory hit Eira like a hard truth, and her fear changed shape. This was not only about a lost throne or a stolen crown. Veilwatch had been built on a secret sacrifice, and the royal line had been the key to the seal ever since. Eira was the last heir because her blood was the only blood that could speak to the prison and keep it from breaking apart. That was why the sword had chosen her, and that was why Victor had watched her so carefully from the start. He had believed her blood could open the way to the hidden power below. He was wrong about the shape of that power, but not wrong about its value. The Titan gave another long, mournful sound, and the broken iron pylon near the stair groaned under a fresh pull from beneath the floor. Black chains dragged across stone, then snapped tight again, and the floor opened in a wider ring around the seal. The chamber below breathed out a cold wind that smelled of old dust and deep earth. Eira felt the pull of it in her chest, and for one wild second she thought of running. Then she looked at Gideon, who stood between her and the wraiths with his lantern high and his jaw set. She looked at Mara, who had lost her last trace of humor and now carried only fierce focus. They were not here because of royal duty. They were here because they had chosen to stay when the truth got heavy. Eira lifted the Eclipse blade higher, and the cold glow ran along its edge in thin Eclipse lines. She told them the truth in a steady voice. The Titan was not the enemy. The prison under it held something worse, and Victor wanted the seal broken so he could take control of whatever waited in the dark. Mara frowned because she did not like mysteries that kept growing teeth, but she believed Eira. Gideon nodded once because the old records had always hinted at a hidden seal beneath the seal, and now the pieces fit. Then Victor stepped closer to the widening opening, and for the first time his calm face slipped. He wanted the same thing as the first king once had, power over the thing below, but he lacked the wisdom to see the cost. He reached toward Eira and said that her bloodline had already chosen a side, so she should choose the winning one before the kingdom fell. Eira almost believed him for a heartbeat because the weight of the truth was too much and the dark below seemed endless. Then the Titan moved again, and the whole floor shook hard enough to throw loose stones into the air. From the dark chamber below came a new sound, not a roar and not a cry, but the slow turn of something immense waking fully to notice them all. Eira planted her feet, Gideon pulled Mara back from the edge, and the three of them braced together as the broken seal flared with ancient light. The stairway downward was no longer just a path. It was a choice, and whatever waited below was now awake enough to answer their next move. The story did not end there. It only dropped deeper into the dark where the next truth was waiting with open eyes. The stairway under Veilwatch led into a cold place where old stone held no warmth, and every breath seemed to return with a hint of ash. The broken kingdom above had already sunk into a permanent eclipse, but this chamber felt even older, as if the dark itself had been locked away here for a very long time. Eira stood at the front with her silver-white hair tied back tight, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the cracked seal below, while Gideon kept his lantern high and Mara stayed half a step behind, ready for trouble. They all knew the same truth now, even if none of them wanted to say it aloud. Something huge had awakened below them, and if they kept going, they might either learn why Veilwatch fell or become part of the reason it never rose again. The seal in the stone floor had split open in a circle of pale light, and the glow made the walls around it tremble. Thin lines of ancient runes began to crawl across the broken stones like waking veins, and then the shadow mist around the chamber pulled backward, as if something down below had taken a long, slow breath. Mara tightened her grip on her scarf and looked from the seal to Eira, because Mara was the skeptic of the group, the one who survived by noticing danger early and trusting almost nothing. Gideon, a middle-aged man with weathered brown skin and short black hair, stood like a shield beside them, because protecting others was what drove him more than fear ever could. Eira, tired but quietly brave, had come this far to find the truth hidden in her blood, and she could feel that the ruined kingdom was waiting for her to choose what kind of woman she would become. Then the first answer came from below, and it was not a voice but a deep motion that shook dust from the ceiling. The broken iron pylon at the edge of the chamber groaned, then tipped a little farther from the stone floor, as if some chain far underground had gone tight. A hard ringing sound rolled up through the stairwell, and the lantern in Gideon's hand flickered white against the black mist. Mara took one sharp step back, then stopped herself, because the stairs behind them had already sealed with falling rubble, and retreat was no longer simple. That made the danger clear in the plainest way possible. They were trapped between the sleeping heart of Veilwatch and the long dark path back to the surface, and Victor was still somewhere above, moving toward them with calm certainty. Eira lifted her chin and looked at the Eclipse blade, the long dark sword that had answered her touch only when her shadow had been separated from her feet. The blade rested in her hand with a cold, sharp glow, and thin eclipse patterns moved along it like quiet fire. She had not trusted the weapon at first because it felt like something made to control more than protect, but the blade had also shown her fragments of the past. It had shown a first king standing in a hall of broken light, wearing a worn royal robe with muted gold trim, his face solemn and heavy with regret. That memory had not been a comfort. It had been a warning. The kingdom had not been destroyed by accident. It had been built on a choice, and that choice had been hidden under layers of fear ever since. Gideon turned the temple lantern toward the open seal, and the pale flame inside pushed back the black mist in a wide, trembling circle. Hidden shapes appeared in the stone for a moment, then vanished again, like the chamber itself was trying to decide what it wanted to reveal. The lantern had been made to weaken shadow magic and expose lies, and that made Gideon the steady center of the group, the man who kept them alive by refusing panic. He stared down at the runes and said the words no one wanted to hear. This was not a normal prison. This was a lock built around something powerful enough to be feared by kings. Mara frowned and moved closer to the edge because she had already guessed that a prison meant a prisoner, and a prisoner meant a reason for Victor to come hunting. He did not chase treasure for simple greed. He chased control because he believed the broken kingdom could only be ruled by the person bold enough to claim its oldest weapon. A low scrape echoed through the dark below them, and then the stairway opened wider as a section of stone slid apart on its own. Cold air rose from the gap, carrying the smell of wet metal, old dust, and something much older than either. Eira felt the hidden birthmark near her collarbone burn with sudden heat, and that made her throat tighten because she knew the royal blood in her body was responding to the chamber. That was when the first twist became clear. The bloodline did not just belong to the kings of Veilwatch, it was part of the lock itself. The prison below had been made to answer royal blood, not because the blood was special in a proud way, but because it was dangerous in a responsible way. The kings had used their own line to keep the Titan of the Western Plain bound under the cratered capital, and the same line could unseal it if someone foolish or cruel used it wrong. Mara looked at Eira with sudden understanding, and her sharp green eyes widened. Victor had never been only after the blade, he had been after Eira. That was why his hunters had followed them with such patience through the ruins, why he had left signs instead of traps in some places, and why he had always seemed one step ahead. He needed royal blood to wake the prison in a controlled way, then bend the Titan to his will by forcing the seal open from the inside. The truth hit hard because it was simple. Victor wanted the Titan not as a monster, but as a tool. He wanted to stand above the ruined kingdom with a power no army could challenge, and he was willing to break the whole hidden prison to get it. Mara cursed under her breath, then steadied herself because fear only helped Victor if it made them slow. The chamber answered again before they could speak more. The runes around the seal flashed, and the ground split in a jagged line that ran toward the broken iron pylon. One of the black chains attached to it snapped tight, and a massive thud rolled through the stone below, heavy enough to make all three of them stumble. Then, through the opening seal, they heard it clearly for the first time. Not a roar and not a cry, but the deep breathing of the Titan of the Western Plain, a massive stone giant with cracked gray skin, glowing rune markings, and sorrow in its dim eyes. It was awake now, or waking, and every chain around it was straining like a net that could not hold forever. Eira felt both fear and pity at once because the Titan did not sound cruel. It sounded trapped, angry, and tired from a very long prison. Gideon raised his lantern higher, and the white light touched a wall beside the seal where no wall should have been visible. Hidden carvings lit up one by one, showing the first king again, this time standing beside the Titan with the same solemn face from the blade memory. The vision was clear enough to understand. The first king had not built this prison to punish a beast. He had built it because the Titan had once chosen to protect Veilwatch from something worse, and the price of that protection had been permanent binding under the city. The kingdom had called it a victory, but it had also been a betrayal. That was the second revelation, and it changed everything. The Titan was not the enemy they had been told to fear. It was a guardian that had been chained for centuries, while the true danger had been kept secret in the royal line and the broken seals below. Mara stared at the carvings, then at Eira, and her voice turned softer than usual. If Victor got to this chamber first, he would not just wake the prison. He would force a loyal guardian into a weaponized shape, and that could tear the cratered capital apart. Eira understood at once why her own fear had been pulling her toward the ruins all along. Her blood was not a mark of power for pride. It was a responsibility left behind by people who had made a terrible mistake and then buried it under stone. She had spent so long thinking she was only a hidden heir, a stray piece of lost royalty. Now she saw that she was also a key, and every key can open a door in the wrong hands. That knowledge changed her from someone running toward answers into someone deciding what those answers would mean. Far above them, a distant Udaya air of stone and metal echoed through the stairwell, and all three turned at once. Victor had reached the outer ruin levels. He was coming down. Eira tightened her grip on the Eclipse blade. Gideon set his feet beside her, and Mara drew a shallow breath, already scanning the dark for a way to buy time. The lantern light, the blade glow, and the seal light mixed together in a sharp silver wash across the chamber, and for one still moment the broken prison looked less like a tomb and more like a battlefield waiting for the first move. Eira felt the Titan stir again beneath her, the chains answering with a violent tremble, and she understood that the next choice would decide more than their survival. It would decide whether Veilwatch stayed broken, whether the Titan stayed bound, and whether Victor reached the heart of the prison before they could stop him. Then the stone below them shuddered once more, the open seal widened another inch, and the dark from beneath looked back with patient, open eyes. The stone chamber under Veilwatch held its breath in the dark, while the broken seal glowed with a weak and sickly light. Above and around it, the ruined kingdom slept under a permanent eclipse, with fallen towers, cracked roads, and old walls that had long ago forgotten their shape. Deep below the cratered capital, the air felt cold and tight, as if the whole prison was a living thing trying not to wake. Eira stood at the center of that silence, her silver-white hair tied back with a dark ribbon, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the widening crack in the floor. She was tired, bruised by too many long nights, but she still held herself straight because she was the one person who could hear the Titan stirring beneath the stone. Gideon stood close beside her, his lantern raised high, his dark brown cloak hanging heavy around his strong shoulders, his face lined with worry and duty. Mara stayed on Eira's other side, her patched red scarf pulled tight at her throat, her curly black hair loose under her hood, her sharp green eyes watching every shadow for movement. They all understood the same danger now. If the seal broke fully, the Titan of the Western Plain could rise. If Victor reached the heart of the prison first, he could force the ancient lock open with royal blood and turn the whole ruin into a gate. And if that happened, Veilwatch would not remain a broken kingdom. It would become a wound that never closed. The stone shuddered again, and the chain links around the Titan sang like iron under strain. A deep shape moved in the darkness under the open crack, and the pressure of that motion rolled through the floor and into their legs. Eira felt fear, but she also felt something else now, something strange and sharp, like the memory of a voice trying to speak through the blade at her side. The Eclipse blade rested in her hand, dark and cold, its narrow guard simple and plain, its black sheen catching the lantern light. Thin eclipse marks flickered across it, then faded again, as if the sword was deciding whether to wake fully. Gideon looked down at the blade, then at Eira, and said in a low voice that the old king did not build this prison to hold only a beast. He built it to keep a secret buried under that beast. Mara frowned at him because she never trusted mystery when a simple answer would do, and she asked what secret could matter more than a Titan. Gideon did not answer right away. He lifted the temple lantern, and its pale flame pushed back the black mist drifting through the broken stone. Then he pointed toward the cracked pylon at the far side of the chamber, where runes were carved into the metal in fading lines. That pylon was one of many anchors, he said, and those anchors did not only hold the Titan down. They also sealed away the throne chamber below. The first king feared that if the wrong blood ever touched the deep seal, something worse than the Titan would use the Titan as a door. Eira listened, and the truth tightened around her chest. She had royal blood hidden from her all her life, and Victor wanted that blood because he already knew what it could open. Then the Wraith army arrived, and all thought ended in motion. Pale figures rose from the broken walls and the cracked floor, their featureless faces turned toward Eira with cold hunger, their thin gray bodies drifting in black mist. They moved fast, much faster than any human soldier, and they did not waste time with fear or words. They wanted the royal blood inside Eira, and they wanted the opening seal, because both of those things would help the prison fail. Mara swore under her breath and pulled her cloak tight as she stepped forward, her whole body becoming a fighter in one smooth movement. She used the hilt of a short blade and the edge of a broken stone pillar to knock the first spirit back, then turned with a sharp kick to drive another into Gideon's lane of light. Gideon swung the temple lantern in a wide arc, and the pale flame flashed brighter, forcing the black mist to scatter and thin. The wraiths recoiled from the light, but they did not retreat for long. More of them came from the edges of the chamber, crawling out of the dark cracks as if the prison itself had begun to breathe them out. Eira knew they would soon be overwhelmed if they kept fighting here, with the seal widening and the Titan shaking below. So she made the choice that had been building inside her since the first moment she touched the blade. She lifted the Eclipse blade with both hands, stepped into the line of lantern light, and pulled her own shadow away from the sword with a quick turn of her body. The old rule answered at once. The blade awakened. Cold light ran along the dark metal, and the Eclipse patterns flared with a hard silver glow. For one clear moment, the sword felt alive in her grip, like it had been waiting for her to understand the shape of the prison. Eira swung once, not in rage but in control, and the awakened blade cut through the black mist that clothed the nearest wraiths. Their forms broke apart into drifting shadows, forced back by the sharp light, while the rest of the army hesitated for the first time. In that brief pause, the chamber wall behind them cracked open with a heavy sound, and Victor stepped through the dust with calm, measured steps. His long black coat moved like a shadow of its own, and his pale face showed no surprise at all. His sharp gray hair was neat, his narrow silver eyes cold and focused, and he carried himself like a man walking into a room he already owned. He looked at Eira, then at the blade, and smiled without warmth. He said the old king had been clever, but not clever enough. He said the prison was never meant to last forever. It was meant to delay the truth until someone brave enough or foolish enough would arrive. Eira hated how calm he sounded because it made his cruelty feel planned, not wild. Victor explained his motive at last, and the words made the whole chamber seem smaller. His family had served the throne long ago, but they were cast out when the first king chose secrecy over power. Victor had spent his life studying the broken records of Veilwatch, learning that the Titan was bound to a hidden chamber where the true source of the eclipse was sealed. He believed that whoever controlled that source could end the permanent darkness and rule the kingdom that rose after it. To him, the prison was not a warning, it was a key. Victor moved first. He did not attack Eira directly. Instead, he threw a black sigil onto the floor, and the sigil spread like spilled ink, reaching toward the cracked pylon and the widening seal. The runes on the metal flared, the chains jerked hard, and the Titan gave a deep, sorrowful groan from below. That sound shook the chamber more than any strike. Mara lunged toward Victor, but two wraiths cut across her path and forced her back against a broken stone pillar. Gideon hurried to her side, lantern raised, and together they held the shadow forms at bay, but the pressure in the floor kept growing. Eira felt the hidden memory inside the Eclipse blade stir again, and then it happened. The blade flashed and the air around her changed. The chamber was still there, but another image rose over it like a clear reflection in dark water. She saw the first king of Veilwatch standing in the Eclipse hall with a worn royal robe and muted gold trim. His short dark hair was neatly cut, his face solemn and tired, and his hands rested on the same blade now in Eira grip. The old memory did not speak in riddles. It spoke plainly, as if the blade itself wanted the truth to survive. The king had not hidden the Titan because he feared it would break free. He had hidden the Titan because it was guarding his own mistake. Long ago, the king had used royal blood to bind the source of the Eclipse inside the cratered capital, and the Titan had become the lock around it. If that source woke, it would draw every shadow in Veilwatch into one body and give the darkness a will of its own. Victor wanted that power, but he did not understand that the power would not serve him. It would consume everything around it. Eira understood the twist at once, and her breath caught. The Titan was not the enemy, it was the prison warden. That truth changed her fear into purpose. Eira turned toward the broken iron pylon, even as the chamber shook harder and the seal widened another inch. She shouted to Gideon and Mara that the Titan must stay bound, even if they had to break Victor's plan in the process. Gideon understood before Mara did, because he had spent his life guarding old ruins and learning how sealed things survive. He took the lantern lower, pushing its pale flame directly against the black sigil Victor had cast. Mara saw the opening in the fight and ran, slipping past a lurching wraith to slam her shoulder into Victor before he could reach the pylon again. Victor stumbled only one step, but that step was enough. Eira drove the awakened blade into the crack beside the pylon, not to break it, but to steady the rune circle around it. The Eclipse light spread from the blade into the old metal, and the chains above them steadied for the first time since the chamber began to shake. The Titan below answered with another deep movement, but this one was slower, as if it recognized the sword and the bloodline that held it. Victor saw what was happening, and for the first time his cold face showed real anger. He called the wraiths together and they surged in a final rush toward Eira, Gideon, and Mara. The lantern flashed. The sword burned cold. Mara held the line with a fierce shout. Gideon stood firm at her side. Eira planted her feet, feeling the royal birthmark near her collarbone pulse with heat under her clothes, and she spoke the first king words that had come through the blade. She did not speak them as a queen. She spoke them as a guardian. She commanded the seal to hold. The chamber answered with a violent but clean burst of light, and the wraith army was driven back in a wave of broken mist. Victor was forced to retreat to the far edge of the chamber, his coat torn by the force, his silver eyes narrowed with shock and fury. The seal did not close fully, but it stopped widening. The Titan remained beneath the stone, still awake, still dangerous, but no longer thrashing against the chains. Eira did not feel victory the way songs describe it. She felt the hard, quiet relief of someone who has kept a door shut with both hands while standing in the rain. Around her, the chamber settled by degrees, and the shadow mist thinned enough for the lantern light to reach the walls. Mara bent over, breathing hard, then looked up at Eira with new respect. Gideon watched the chains and nodded once because he understood that the prison was still holding, and that mattered more than pride. Victor, however, did not leave defeated in mind, only in position. He backed into the dust with a small, thin smile returning to his face, as if he had already learned enough from this clash to make his next move better. Before vanishing into the dark tunnel behind him, he said the truth had finally been found, and that meant the next seal would not be guarded by lies anymore. Eira did not answer him. She looked at the cracked pylon, the steady chains, and the ancient stone floor under her boots, and she understood the road ahead was still long. Veilwatch was not saved yet. The cratered capital still hid its deepest chamber, the Titan still carried the burden of the old king, and Victor still knew too much. But now Eira knew the most important thing of all. She was not just a frightened heir stumbling through ruins. She was the one chosen to decide what the kingdom would become, and she would follow that truth into the dark, even if the next step led deeper under the broken crown of Veilwatch. The shattered roads of Veilwatch stretched under a sky that never truly brightened, and the permanent eclipse made every ruin look cold and tired. Broken towers leaned over cratered streets, ash gathered in the cracks of old stone, and the wind carried a soft moan through the empty capital. Below that ruined surface, the deepest chamber still waited in silence, and everyone knew the kingdom would not survive if Victor reached it first. Eira stood at the edge of that broken world with Gideon beside her, Mara watching the dark alleys, and the Eclipse blade hidden close where only a brave hand could reach it. They had already lost too much ground, and now the road ahead opened into the kind of darkness that did not forgive mistakes. Eira was tired, and she did not hide it anymore. Her pale face showed the strain of every step, her gray-blue eyes kept drifting to the shadows, and her long silver-white hair moved against the dark ribbon tied at the back of her head. Beneath her cloak and black tunic, the royal birthmark near her collarbone still marked her as the last clear hope of the old line, and that truth now felt heavier than fear. Gideon, a strong middle-aged man with weathered brown skin and short black hair, held his lantern in one hand and walked like a guard who had already chosen to stand between danger and the people beside him. He wanted to keep Eira alive long enough to make the right choice because he had seen too many rulers choose badly. Mara, a young woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and sharp green eyes, stayed half a step ahead with a skeptical look and a ready posture because she trusted action more than promises and had learned that ruins always hid new trouble. Together they all understood the same simple thing, which was that Veilwatch was still broken, and if Victor claimed the chamber below, then the kingdom would become a cage built from its own scars. Victor was already moving through the ruined capital with calm and careful purpose. He was a slim man with pale skin, sharp gray hair, and narrow silver eyes, and he wore a long black coat that made him look like he belonged to the dark itself. Unlike the monsters that lurked in the ruin, Victor did not rush and he did not rage because he believed control was stronger than fear. He wanted the deepest chamber because he believed the old prison under Veilwatch was not just a tomb for secrets, but a machine of power that could bind the Titan of the Western Plain, command the Wraith army, and turn royal blood into a key for rule. In his mind, the old kings had failed because they had trusted mercy, and he wanted to fix that failure by building a kingdom that would obey without question. That was why he hunted Eira so closely. He did not simply want to capture a princess. He needed the royal blood in her body, the blade that answered shadow, and the Titan that still carried the burden of the first king, because he believed all three together would let him lock Veilwatch under his hand forever. As he closed in, the pale spirits of the Wraith army slipped through broken streets around him, silent and hungry, drawn to the same royal signal that made Eira such a target. The first warning came from Gideon lantern light, which quivered as black mist curled through a collapsed archway. The temple lantern in his hand pushed back the shadow mist and revealed thin figures sliding between fallen stones, their featureless faces turning toward Eira like starving masks. The Wraith army had returned in greater number, and their hunger made the air feel thin and cold. Mara hissed a warning, drew her blade, and moved to the side as the spirits rushed with unnatural speed. Gideon lifted the lantern high, and the pale flame burst brighter, weakening the mist around the nearest wraiths. Eira felt the old fear rise in her chest, but this time she did not run from it. She reached for the Eclipse blade, and because Mara had already stepped into the light while Gideon held the lantern behind her, Eira and her shadow split apart across the broken stones. The sword awakened in her grip with a cold, sharp glow, and the thin eclipse patterns along the blade lit up like a promise. She drew it fully, and the dark metal sang with a low, clear tone that cut through the whispering gloom. The nearest wraiths recoiled, and for a moment the whole ruin seemed to pause, as if even the darkness recognized her choice. That pause did not last long. The ground trembled, and a heavy sound rolled up from beneath the capital like a giant turning in its sleep. Far below, the Titan of the Western Plain shifted against its chains, and the deep pull of its sorrow passed through the stone under their feet. Through a cracked street opening, Eira saw part of the giant shape in the distance, its cracked gray skin marked with faint rune light and its black chains pulled tight around its massive body. One broken iron pylon had torn half free from the floor, and that crack was more than damage. It was a warning. The Titan had once been held in place for a reason, and the reason was now failing. Gideon said the first king used the Titan as a seal, not a slave, because the giant carried the burden of whatever waited below the chamber. Mara stared at the shifting chains and finally admitted the obvious truth, which was that Victor was not trying to save the kingdom at all. He was trying to control the seal without understanding what it contained. That revelation changed the shape of the danger, because if the Titan broke free before they reached the chamber, the whole cratered capital could collapse into the depths beneath it. Eira did not answer at first because another thought struck her with painful clarity. The first king had not only hidden the prison, he had also left signs for someone with royal blood to find it, and the blade was part of that message. Gideon reached into his cloak and showed her a worn page copied from old records where the memory of the first king in the Eclipse Hall had been described as solemn and tired, not cruel. The memory was simple and hard to ignore. The first king had made a choice to bind the Titan, seal the chamber, and keep the royal line close to the burden, because he feared what greedy hands would do if the prison opened. This was the twist that changed everything for Eira. The old kingdom had not only been betrayed from outside, it had also been protected by a sacrifice that later kings had hidden because they wanted the legend of strength more than the truth of fear. Eira realized that Victor knew part of this secret, but not all of it. He understood the prison as a tool, yet he did not understand the warning woven into it. The royal blood was not a key meant to command. It was a test meant to decide who could carry the weight without breaking the world. Before she could speak, Victor stepped out from a shattered hall ahead of them, and the lantern light revealed his cold face in full. He had followed them through the ruin by reading their path, and now he stood with quiet confidence as if the outcome was already his. Around him, the wraiths gathered like drifting ash, and their hollow bodies moved in a ring that narrowed the street. Victor told Eira that hesitation had already ruined her house, and that mercy had always been the weakness of rulers who were too afraid to act. He said the Titan should be controlled, the prison should be opened, and the kingdom should be rebuilt under a single hand so that no one could ever threaten it again. Eira listened, and for a brief moment she saw how deeply his fear ruled him. Victor was not chasing power because he loved destruction. He was chasing power because he had seen disorder and decided fear was the only answer. That made him more dangerous, not less, because he could always justify the next cruel step as wisdom. Then he reached toward the blade, and the wraith surged at once. The clash that followed was fast and desperate. Mara cut across the left flank and forced two spirits back into the dark. Gideon raised the temple lantern and held the wraith mist open long enough for Eira to move through a gap. Eira met Victor in the middle of the broken street, and the Eclipse blade flashed with cold light against his controlled movements. He fought with clean precision, not wild rage, and every strike showed that he had studied her habits before this moment. He tried to separate her from the lantern light because he understood the blade only stayed awake when her shadow was apart from her body. He nearly succeeded when one wraith slammed into Gideon and knocked the lantern low, but Mara kicked a fallen stone into the spirit mass and gave Gideon time to recover. That one small act kept Eira standing, and she used the opening to drive Victor back a step. Still, he smiled as if the setback only proved his point. He said the kingdom would always need someone willing to make hard choices, and if Eira would not do it, then he would. Then the floor cracked again, and a deep rumble came from below like a locked door straining against a storm. The broken iron pylon beside the street split with a sharp metallic sound, and a surge of black mist burst from the crack in the stone. The wraiths turned away from the fight at once, pulled toward the opening as if something older and hungrier had called them. Even Victor looked uneasy for the first time, which told Eira that he had not expected this much weakness in the seal. Gideon grabbed Eira by the shoulder and shouted that the chamber was waking, which meant they had reached the edge of the true descent far sooner than planned. Mara looked back toward the Titan, where the chains groaned and the giant lifted its head just enough for its dull eyes to catch the eclipse light. The sorrow in that ancient face was plain, and Eira suddenly understood that the Titan had not been guarding the kingdom from outside enemies. It had been standing watch over the prison below, carrying pain for centuries so the rest of the world would not have to face what slept there. Eira tightened her grip on the Eclipse blade and felt the royal birthmark beneath her collarbone burn with a quiet pulse. She did not know the full shape of the chamber yet, and she did not know what waited beneath the cracked throne room, but she finally understood her role. She was not chosen to rule by fear, and she was not chosen to obey Victor or repeat the mistakes of the past. She was chosen to decide what Veilwatch would become, and that meant choosing whether the burden would stay buried, who would bear it, and how much truth the kingdom could survive. She stepped toward the tearing crack in the stone, while Gideon kept the lantern bright and Mara turned to cover their backs. Behind them, Victor lifted his hand and began to call the wraiths back into formation, because he had not lost his plan, only one small part of it. Below them, the hidden chamber answered with another low tremor, and the path downward opened wider into darkness. Eira moved first, not because she was fearless, but because she was finally willing to be brave, and as she entered the broken stair beneath Veilwatch, she understood that the next choice would change the whole kingdom. The darkness below waited like a held breath, and somewhere inside that deep ruin, the old prison kept its secrets close. Victor followed with patient steps, the Titan groaned far above, and the lantern light trembled against the stone walls as the descent began. Eira did not look back because the future of Veilwatch was no longer behind her. It was waiting below, and she was going to meet it. The stairs under Veilwatch dropped into a colder world, where stone sweat ran down the walls and old air pressed against every breath. Eira moved first, with her silver-white hair tied back tight, her dark cloak brushing the broken steps and her gray-blue eyes fixed on the dark path below. Gideon stayed one step behind her, his brown skin lit by the soft white flame of the temple lantern, and his serious face never lost focus. Mara followed close after him, her curly black hair tucked under her hood, her patched red scarf standing out like a warning sign in the gloom. Victor came last, pale and calm in his long black coat, with sharp gray hair and narrow silver eyes that watched everything and trusted nothing. Above them, the Titan of the Western Plain groaned through the cracked ceiling, and that sound made the old prison feel awake. Everyone understood the danger now, because if the prison below opened the wrong way, Veilwatch could lose its last seal, the Titan could break free, and the Wraith army could flood the cratered capital in silent hunger. Yet Victor still wanted to go deeper because he believed the prison held a royal lock, and he believed Eira carried the key inside her blood. He wanted the power of the old kingdom, not to save it, but to command it. Eira knew only one thing for certain. If she let Victor reach the heart of the ruin first, the kingdom would be lost before anyone could fight for it. So she kept moving, even when the steps turned to rubble and the shadows ahead began to breathe. The lantern light slid over broken iron rails, cracked demon-forged walls, and old marks carved into the stone by hands long gone. Then the passage opened into a wide chamber with a half-buried gate, and the gate carried the seal of the first king of Veilwatch. The seal was a circle cut by a black line, and beneath it lay 3 deep grooves for a blade, a hand, and a name. Eira stopped at once because she felt something pull at her chest, close to the royal birthmark hidden near her collarbone. She had always been told that mark meant little, only a trace from a forgotten branch of the royal line, but now the stone seemed to answer it. Gideon noticed her fear and stepped beside her. He said the temple lantern could weaken the shadow mist around the seal, but it could not force truth out of old stone. Mara crouched near the gate and studied the grooves with sharp eyes. She said the place was built for a lock, not a prison, and that meant someone wanted this door closed for a reason. Victor smiled at that because the first real clue had confirmed what he hoped. He explained with calm patience that the first king had hidden a royal weapon below the capital, and that the old stories about a prison were only a cover. He said the kingdom was built on fear, and the fear was used to keep powerful people away from what was rightfully theirs. But Eira saw the lie inside his words because he never spoke of the people of Veilwatch, only of control. He wanted the blade, the chamber, and the Titan bound below because those things could make him the master of the broken kingdom. That was when a low hum moved through the floor and thin black mist began to slip from the cracks around the gate. The Wraith army had not arrived in full, but their hunger had found the royal blood in Eira, and the sound of the gate had called them closer. Gideon raised the lantern higher, and the pale flame pushed the mist back for a moment, making the hidden runes on the gate glow a weak white. Mara drew a small blade and took a guard stance, her whole body ready to move. Eira reached toward the stone, then stopped when Victor spoke her name in a low voice. He told her she was not just a survivor from the ruins and not just a girl hidden from court. He said she was the living answer to the old seal. He said the first king had not only built the prison, but had also placed one last rule upon it. Royal blood alone could wake the Eclipse blade, and the blade could only be drawn when the user and their shadow stood apart. That was why the place had waited so long. That was why the prison had never opened for thieves or soldiers. It needed a bloodline, a shadow, and a choice. Eira felt her throat tighten because the rule sounded impossible at first, yet the stone around her seemed to remember it. She glanced down and saw the lantern light separating her shadow from her feet as it fell across a cracked ledge behind her. The dark shape stretched the wrong way for one small instant, and in that instant the runes around the gate flashed awake. The hidden blade rested in a long niche beside the door, its dark metal wrapped in old dust, its narrow guard simple and plain. Thin eclipse patterns moved along its length like sleeping sparks. Eira understood then that the blade had been waiting for her all along, and the truth hit her harder than any threat. Her blood was not a flaw or a rumor, it was a lock and a warning both. She reached for the hilt, but Victor moved at the same time, his hand fast and sharp. He had never intended to let her claim the blade alone. He wanted the weapon first, because if he could pull it with her shadow separated, he believed he could force the prison open and command what slept beneath it. Mara shouted for Eira to move, and Gideon thrust the lantern between Victor and the niche, flooding the chamber with white light. The shadow mist recoiled at once, and Victor was forced to step back as the runes flared brighter. Eira did not waste the opening. She slid one boot onto the broken edge of the floor and let the lantern light split her shadow from the stone. Then she wrapped her gloved hand around the wrapped grip and drew the Eclipse blade free. The blade came out with a cold, sharp shine, and every line of its eclipse pattern lit at once. The chamber trembled. Far above, the Titan gave a deeper groan, as if it had felt the awakening below. At the same time, the gate seal unlocked with a hard sound, and behind it a narrow stair of black stone sank into darkness even older than the chamber. Before anyone could move, the floor shook again, and a section of the broken iron pylon nearby cracked loose with a metallic scream. The huge anchor pillar once used to hold the Titan in place shifted from the floor and slammed against the wall. Dust burst through the air. Mara grabbed Gideon by the sleeve and pulled him clear. Eira held the blade steady, but she felt the weapon pull toward the newly opened stair, almost as if it knew the way. Victor looked from the blade to the opening, and for the first time his calm face changed. He had expected a key, but he had found a deeper mechanism. The prison was not only below the gate was only the first lock. A colder secret waited in the lower dark, and the old king had hidden it for a reason Victor had not guessed. Then the truth came through the chamber in a wave of memory, and the air itself seemed to split. Eira saw the figure of the royal archivist memory rise from the light, an old vision of the first king in a worn royal robe with muted gold trim, his short dark hair neat, his face solemn and tired. The vision did not speak at first, but it placed a hand over the gate seal, and the whole chamber answered. Gideon stared in silence, because even he, who had carried the lantern through ruin and ash, had never seen a royal memory hold so clearly. The king vision finally turned toward Eira, and his eyes carried grief more than pride. He showed her, not with words but with motion, that the prison below had never held a monster for punishment. It had held the Titan to stop it from being used. Long ago, the first king had learned that the Titan of the Western Plain could wake through the eclipse, and that any ruler hungry for power could ride that wake and throw the kingdom into endless ruin. So he chained the Titan, built Veilwatch above it, and hid the Eclipse Hall under the cratered capital so no greedy hand could reach it without the royal line. Victor listened, and his expression sharpened into open anger because the memory had ruined his grand story. He had believed he could claim the Titan, but the truth was worse and better at once. The Titan was not a weapon waiting to serve him. It was a bound guardian, kept in pain to protect the kingdom from its own worst rulers. That realization did not make Victor turn back, it made him more dangerous. He said the old king had been weak, that a true ruler should command power instead of hiding it, and that Eira stood in his way now. He reached for the open stair, and black mist surged after him as if the wraith army answered his wish. Mara stepped in front of the opening with her blade ready, brave, and angry, while Gideon lifted the lantern and called for Eira to trust the memory, not the fear. Eira looked once more at the vision of the first king. She saw not a tyrant, but a man who had chosen burden over glory. She understood then that royal blood was not meant to rule by force, it was meant to keep a promise. The chamber shook harder, and the broken iron pylon beside the wall began to slide, threatening to smash the stair and trap them all inside. Eira tightened her grip on the Eclipse blade, and the cold light of the weapon spread across her gloves and cloak. She did not know yet what waited in the Eclipse Hall, and she did not know how deep the prison went. But she knew the next choice was no longer about her fear. It was about whether she would follow Victor into power or follow the old king into sacrifice. The lantern light flickered, the Titan groaned above, the wraith mist pressed against the gate, and in the black stair below a second set of runes slowly began to wake. The black stair breathed cold air, and the hidden chamber below waited like a held breath in the dark. Eira stood at the top step with the cursed Eclipse blade in her hand, and its cold light painted the stone in pale lines. Gideon held the temple lantern close to her side, and the soft flame shook inside the dark metal frame. Mara stayed one step behind them, her green eyes fixed on the stair and her jaw set hard with caution. Above them, the Titan of the Western Plain groaned again, and the sound rolled through Veilwatch like a warning from under the earth. Every one of them understood the danger now, because the prison was not sleeping anymore, and the Wraith army was already pressing against the gate behind them. Victor wanted the hidden power below for himself, because he believed only a single ruler with complete control could stop the curse from spreading. The old king wanted sacrifice, because he believed the prison could only hold if royal blood sealed it once more. Eira did not yet know which of them was right, but she knew the next choice would not wait for comfort or fear. They descended one careful step at a time, and the runes on the wall woke as they passed. Soft gray light moved across broken stone, then gathered in a ring around the stairwell like watching eyes. Gideon raised the lantern higher, and the pale flame pushed back the shadow mist that curled along the edges. The lantern did not destroy the darkness, but it made the hidden shapes weaker, and that mattered now more than ever. Mara touched the wall once, felt the warm pulse under the stone, and pulled her hand back with a sharp breath. She was a survivor before anything else, and she had learned that old places often kept one more trap than they showed. Eira watched the sword in her hand, and she saw the Eclipse patterns deepen along its dark blade. The weapon had only awakened when her shadow separated from her body near the gate, and that rule now felt less like a trick and more like a lock made by careful hands. The blade had chosen her because her blood carried the royal line, but it had also chosen her because she had stepped away from fear. That choice mattered, and everyone in the stair felt it. Then a chamber opened below them, wide and round, with a floor of cracked black stone and a high ceiling cut by broken arches. At the far side stood the Eclipse Hall, hidden inside the ruined heart of Veilwatch, and its doors were open just enough to let old light spill through. Inside the hall, the air was still and cold, and the walls were covered in faded royal marks. A great circle of stone lay in the center, split by deep lines that matched the shape of the blade. Around that circle stood old iron chains, some snapped, some bent, and some buried under dust as if they had been there for centuries. In the middle of the chamber, the memory of the first king appeared like a living echo. He stood with short dark hair, a worn royal robe with muted gold trim, and a face worn down by grief. This was not a ghost in the simple sense, but a royal memory tied to the blade and the prison itself, a message left behind when words could not survive. He looked at Eira first, then at Gideon, then at Mara, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who had made a terrible choice for a good reason. He spoke without moving his mouth, and his voice filled the hall like water filling a cracked bowl. He said that Veilwatch was not built to rule the world, but to hide a wound in it. Long ago, the Titan had been chained beneath the capital because it had been the only force strong enough to hold the wraiths back after the Eclipse curse first spread. The Titan itself was not evil, but it had been trapped by the old kings because it had the strength to serve as a living lock. The Wraith army, hungry and silent, was drawn to royal blood because the prison had been made with the line of kings as part of its seal. That was why the blood mattered, and that was why Victor had hunted Eira so fiercely. He did not only want a throne, he wanted the key. The memory then turned its gaze toward the broken floor, and a hidden panel opened with a low crack. Beneath it lay a second chamber, deeper and darker, with another ring of runes slowly lighting up in the stone. The old king warned them that if the lower seal broke completely, the Titan would wake in pain and the Wraith army would pour through every gap in the cratered capital. He said the blade could cut or bind, but only when the shadow of the bearer was separated, because the weapon was made to work between two worlds at once. He also said the blade would answer only a true heir, and not because of honor, but because blood carried memory in this place. Eira listened closely, and for the first time she understood that her birthmark was not a simple sign of royalty. It was proof that she had been hidden for a reason. She was not just a lost daughter of Veilwatch, she was part of the seal. Gideon looked at her with a hard, protective sadness because he had known more than he told. He had carried the temple lantern through the outer ruins not only to guide her, but to bring her here before Victor could claim her. Mara caught his look and realized the truth before Eira fully spoke it. Gideon had once served near the royal archives, and he had helped hide the child when the court began to fear what the bloodline might awaken. The old king had trusted him with that task, and that trust had followed him through every dark road since. That was the twist waiting under the hall. Eira had not been lost by accident. She had been hidden to keep Victor from using her as a living key. The hall shuddered then, and the shock ran through the floor like a strong hand hitting a drum. Dust fell from the ceiling. Far above, the Titan gave another deep, pained groan, and the chains in the lower chamber answered with a rough metallic cry. Victor stepped through the side arch at that exact moment, as calm and sharp as ever, his gray hair neat, his black coat untouched by the dust. He had followed them with the patience of a hunter, and he did not bother to hide it. Behind him came two wraiths, pale and hollow, their bodies wrapped in black mist that moved faster than smoke. Victor raised one hand, and the wraiths held back because he did not need them to attack yet. He wanted Eira to hear him first. He said that the old king had lied by calling this a prison, because Victor believed it was really a machine, built to keep power in the hands of the few. He said the Titan should be awakened fully, not chained, because only a controlled force could crush the curse before it spread beyond Veilwatch. He called sacrifice weak, and he called mercy a story that frightened leaders into failure. Then he looked directly at Eira and told her that her blood could open the lower seal, command the blade, and put an end to the long rot of the kingdom. His motive was plain now, and it was terrible in a very human way. He had watched fear break kingdoms, and he had decided that control was kinder than hope. He truly believed that if he held the Titan, the sword, and the bloodline together, he could build a safer world. The problem was that he would use any person, any promise, and any wound to get there. Mara moved first. She hurled a small metal charm from her belt, and it struck the stone near Victor with a sharp flash of lantern light. The burst was not strong enough to harm him, but it scattered the shadow mist and forced the wraiths to retreat a few steps. Gideon swung the temple lantern wide, and the pale flame brightened until the hall looked almost silver. The hidden runes on the floor answered the light, and the lower seal opened another hand span with a grinding sound. Eira saw the moment for what it was. If the seal opened too far, the Titan might rise in full pain and the whole prison could crack open. If it stayed shut, Victor might seize control and drain the royal bloodline dry for his plan. Either way, the next choice would change everything. The old king memory faced her again, and this time his voice softened. He did not ask her to obey him. He asked her to decide what the crown had never taught anyone, which was how to carry power without becoming its servant. Eira remembered every part of her life that had made her wary, every road where she had been told to stay small, and every time she had been afraid to trust her own hands. Now she lifted the Eclipse blade, and the cold light spread brighter across her gloves and cloak. She did not point it at Victor. She pointed it at the broken iron pylon beside the lower seal. In that instant, she understood the real purpose of the weapon. It was not only for attack. It was for cutting the chains that bound the wrong thing and leaving the right thing alive. Eira drove the blade down, and the Eclipse light split across the broken iron pylon in a sharp white line. The metal groaned, then gave way with a heavy crash, and one part of the seal loosened just enough for the Titan below to stop straining against its bonds. The hall trembled, but it did not collapse. That small difference saved everyone in the room. Victor stepped back for the first time, his cool face tightening as he saw his plan shift out of reach. The wraiths surged forward anyway, but the lantern and the blade worked together now, and the shadow mist thinned under their light. Mara moved beside Eira and guided her stance with quick, sure words, while Gideon held the lantern steady and took the shock of the darkness without turning away. The three of them were no longer a group of strangers moving through ruin. They were a team, and each of them knew exactly why they mattered. Eira had the blood. Gideon had the knowledge. Mara had the courage to see what others missed. Victor had power and patience, but he lacked trust, and that was beginning to cost him. As the lower seal cracked open just enough to reveal a stone stair leading deeper under the capital, the old king memory turned one last time toward Eira. He told her that the prison had never been meant to last forever. It had only been meant to survive long enough for the right heir to choose a better way. Then his image thinned like smoke in the lantern light, leaving Eira with one clear truth and one terrible path ahead. She could feel the deeper chamber below, and something there was waiting for her answer. Victor was not finished, the Titan was not fully calm, and the Wraith army was still pressing at the outer gate. But now Eira stood straighter than before, because fear no longer ruled her steps. She was no longer chasing the truth. She was carrying it, and the next descent would take her closer to the heart of Veilwatch than anyone had ever gone before. The air inside Veilwatch felt colder now, and the ruined stone around Eira seemed to listen to every step she took. Far above her, the outer gate still shuddered under the pressure of the wraith army, while deep below, the hidden chamber waited in silence like a mouth that had never finished speaking. Gideon stood close beside her with his temple lantern raised, his weathered face set in hard lines because he was a middle-aged man with short black hair, a strong build, and a stubborn need to keep others alive even when the odds looked cruel. Mara stayed on Eira's other side, and she was a young woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, sharp green eyes, a patched red scarf, and the careful stance of someone who never trusted a quiet room. Eira herself, a young woman with pale skin, gray-blue eyes, and long silver-white hair tied back with a dark ribbon, lifted her chin and faced the dark stair below, because she now knew the truth of the Eclipse blade, the prison beneath the palace, and the royal blood that the wraiths were hunting. The central danger was simple and terrible, and all of them understood it now. If Victor reached the heart of Veilwatch first, he would use the old power sealed there to control the Titan, command the wraiths, and tear the last lock from the fallen kingdom before anyone could stop him. Eira did not speak for a moment because she was no longer trying to be brave in a loud way. She had become the kind of brave that keeps moving while fear still shakes the hands. Then she took the first step down, and Gideon and Mara followed her into the deeper dark. The stairway under the capital was narrow, broken, and lined with old royal stone that still held faint traces of gold dust in its cracks. Gideon swept the lantern ahead, and the pale flame pushed back the shadow mist in slow waves, revealing symbols cut into the walls and old warning marks placed by hands long gone. Mara studied every sign with quick eyes because she wanted answers as badly as she wanted to survive, and she had never liked any story that depended on blind trust. Eira kept one hand near the wrapped grip of the Eclipse blade because the sword had changed in her hands since the memory in the Eclipse Hall had opened before her. It was a long, dark metallic sword with a faint black sheen, a narrow guard, and thin eclipse patterns that only glowed when it was awake. It could only be drawn when the user and their shadow were separated, and now Eira understood why the first king had made such a strange rule. The blade was not a simple weapon. It was a key that answered only when a person stood apart from their own shadow, which meant it could judge the soul of whoever tried to use it. That was why Victor wanted it so badly. He did not just want power. He wanted a power that would choose him, even if he had to force the world to kneel before him first. As they moved deeper, the memory of the old king stirred again inside the blade, and for one brief breath the walls around them faded into a vision of the Eclipse Hall, where the first king stood in a worn royal robe with muted gold trim, his short dark hair neat, his solemn face tired but steady. He had built the prison below not to hide treasure, but to hide a wound in the world. He had sealed the Titan beneath Veilwatch after the giant had been used as a living anchor for a gate to the Shadow Realm, and he had bound the wraiths to royal blood so that only the bloodline could keep the seal from being broken too early. Eira felt her stomach tighten as the truth became clearer. The kingdom had not fallen by accident. It had been protected by people who feared what would happen if the seal broke while greedy hands still ruled the throne. A low sound rolled through the stone, and the whole stairwell trembled under it. Then Victor appeared at the far end of the corridor, stepping out of a broken arch with his long black coat falling cleanly around his slim frame. He was a pale man with sharp gray hair, narrow silver eyes, and the cold calm of someone who never wasted a move. Behind him drifted two ranks of the Wraith army, their pale bodies thin and hollow, their broken faces empty, black mist sliding around their limbs as they moved with hungry speed. Victor looked at Eira as if she were not a person but a final piece he had been waiting to place on a board. He had followed them into the lower chamber because he had already learned what Eira had learned, and his motive now stood clear in his own words. The old seal had begun to weaken, and only the royal bloodline could open the chamber without shattering the prison at once. Victor believed the world would always be ruled by fear, so he wanted to be the one holding that fear in his hand. If he controlled the Titan and the wraiths, then every surviving kingdom would bow to him and no one would ever challenge his will again. That was not madness to him, it was order. He raised one hand and the wraiths surged forward, but Gideon thrust the lantern light into their path, and the pale flame cracked through their shadow mist like a blade of dawn. Mara moved fast beside him, using the broken stone and old pillars to keep the enemy from surrounding them, while Eira drew the Eclipse blade at last, just as her own shadow split away from her feet in the lantern light. The sword awakened with a cold shine, and the Eclipse patterns lit up like thin rings of night. The wraiths recoiled for one heartbeat because the blade had answered the one thing they could not understand, a royal heir who had finally chosen truth over fear. Eira stepped forward and drove the glowing edge through the air in a clean arc, not to wound, but to sever the shadow mist that fed the wraiths. Several of them were forced back in a drifting collapse, and Victor narrowed his eyes for the first time because he had expected a frightened girl and found a defender instead. The ground shook again, harder this time, and a deeper noise answered from below. Far beneath the stairwell, the Titan of the Western Plain had begun to stir. Eira felt it through the stone before she saw it, a vast sorrow moving in the dark like a mountain trying to breathe. They reached a wide landing where a broken iron pylon lay half torn from the floor, black runes still faintly glowing on its cracked metal sides. Gideon pointed the lantern toward it, and the pale light revealed the truth of the chamber below. This pylon had once anchored the Titan, and when it cracked, the old prison had started to fail. Beyond the landing, a massive chamber opened into a sunken hall lined with shattered pillars and fallen royal walls, and in the center stood the Titan itself, its stone body huge and human-shaped, its gray skin cracked, its rune markings lit in weak pulses, and heavy black chains wrapped across its chest and arms. Its eyes glowed with ancient sorrow, not rage, and that changed everything for Eira. This creature had not been made to destroy the kingdom. It had been forced to hold the kingdom together until the seal could be renewed. Victor saw the Titan and smiled because he thought its suffering could be turned into control. He spoke to Eira across the chamber and demanded the blade, telling her that the first king had been weak to trust feelings over power. He said the bloodline had only delayed the inevitable, and that he would use the Titan to crush every rival who still resisted him. Eira answered him with the truth she now carried in full. The first king had not sealed the Titan out of fear alone. He had sealed it because the Titan had chosen to stay as a living lock, and the king had promised that no one would turn that sacrifice into a weapon for greed. Victor laughed softly, but the sound did not reach his eyes. Then he ordered the wraith army forward, and the chamber filled with drifting black mist, cold footsteps, and the sound of old chains straining under a new and dangerous command. Eira did not run. That choice surprised even Mara, who had never trusted courage that looked too clean. Instead, Eira stepped toward the Titan, and as she moved, she saw something hidden in the rune light around its chest. The broken iron pylon was not just damaged. It had been struck from the inside, which meant someone had tried to free the Titan long before Victor arrived. That was the twist that changed the shape of everything, because it meant the royal prison had not simply been failing on its own. Someone in Veilwatch had already worked to break the seal from within, and that person had likely helped Victor come this far. Eira understood then that the enemy was not only outside the royal line. The enemy had been buried inside the kingdom for years, waiting for the right moment to open the wrong door. She turned back to Gideon and Mara, and her voice stayed calm even as the room shook around them. Gideon was to hold the lantern on the lower chains because the light weakened the shadow mist. Mara was to guard the stair and keep the wraiths from circling behind them. Eira would go to the Titan and try to speak to it, because the memory in the blade had shown her one more rule. The Titan responded not to force, but to the truth spoken by royal blood. She moved across the shattered floor while Victor shouted for the wraiths to take her, and when the first pale figures rushed in, Gideon forced them back with the temple lantern, its white flame flaring wide and clean. Mara darted through the broken pillars, striking at mist and shadow with sharp, precise movements that kept the path open. Above them, the old chamber groaned, and the Titan lowered its glowing eyes toward Eira as if it already knew her face. Eira lifted the Eclipse blade not as a threat but as a promise, and she spoke the first line of a vow that the first king had once made in the same place. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the entire fallen kingdom. She was not there to claim the prison. She was there to understand it. And when the Titan heard that, the chains around its body began to shiver, as if the answer had finally found the right lock, while Victor, standing in the shadow of his own plan, realized that Eira had reached the heart of Veilwatch before him after all. The air inside the Eclipse Hall stayed still for one breath, then it began to move again, slow and heavy, like the whole chamber was waking from a long sleep. Broken stone walls curved around Eira, and the floor below her boots was split by deep cracks that had not healed in centuries. The Titan of the Western Plain sat deeper in the chamber, huge and silent, its gray stone body wrapped in black chains that reached into iron pylons sunk all around it. Its eyes held an ancient sorrow, but now that sorrow was not sleeping. It was listening. Eira, a young woman with pale skin, gray-blue eyes, and long silver-white hair tied back with a dark ribbon, stood with tired shoulders and steady feet because she had come this far to answer one simple question. Why had the first king built a prison beneath his own kingdom, and why did the truth still matter now? Gideon, a middle-aged man with weathered brown skin, short black hair, and a strong build, stayed close with his temple lantern held high, because he knew shadow magic could hide traps, spirits, and old lies. Mara, a young woman with dark brown skin, curly black hair, and sharp green eyes, watched every corner with her red scarf pulled tight, because she trusted danger more than she trusted promises. Victor, pale and slim with sharp gray hair and narrow silver eyes, stood back near a broken archway in his long black coat, because he wanted the Titan for himself and had followed Eira only to steal the prize after she found it. He believed the Titan could give him power over the ruins of Veilwatch, and he believed power should belong to the person who could hold it. That was the first clear danger in the chamber, and it was worse than the chains. The chains might break, but Victor wanted the prison to break in his hands for his own rule, and that would turn a forgotten wound into a new disaster. Eira did not look at Victor at first. She looked at the Titan, then at the broken iron pylons, then at the old marks cut into the floor around the chamber. The words she had spoken had been the first line of a vow the first king had once made in the same place, and now she could feel that vow pulling at the air like a hidden rope. The Eclipse blade in her hand gave a faint cold light, and the thin eclipse patterns along its dark metal surface began to wake. She had learned that the blade would only draw when the user and the shadow were separated, and that rule mattered now, because the chamber light from Gideon's lantern stretched every person into a long dark shape across the stone. Eira raised her left hand and let the lantern light fall away from one side of her body. Her shadow slipped in one direction while she stepped in another, and the blade answered with a sharp silver sound. No one moved for a moment. Even Mara leaned forward, startled by how cleanly the sword came free, as if it had waited for this exact choice. Then the chamber responded. The Titan lowered its head by a small but clear amount, and the black chains trembled harder than before. A deep voice rolled through the stone floor, not loud but strong enough to feel in the chest. It was not anger, it was relief. The Titan recognized the vow, it recognized the blood of the first line. Eira froze because she had not expected the prison to know her. She had expected a lock, she had found a witness. Gideon stepped closer, still careful, his lantern held between Eira and the darkest corners of the hall. He had spent years carrying old stories, and now those stories finally formed a shape. He explained in simple words for Eira and Mara and even Victor to hear, that the first king had not built Veilwatch to hide a monster. He had built it after the western plain began to crack open under something ancient, something that woke when royal blood and broken oaths came together. The Titan had not attacked the kingdom. It had been bound after it came to warn the first king that a deeper force was rising below the cratered capital. The king had feared panic, feared war, and feared that his people would tear each other apart if they learned the truth. So he chose a prison, and he used his vow as part of the seal. That was why the vow mattered. It was not a spell for control. It was a promise of responsibility, and as long as the promise remained honored, the Titan could stay calm and the prison could stay closed. Mara frowned hard when she heard that, because it changed everything she had thought about the ruins. She had expected greed or revenge or a simple royal mistake. Instead, she found fear, pride, and a choice that had helped ruin an entire kingdom. Victor smiled without warmth because he understood the same truth in a different way. He had not come for wisdom, he had come for leverage. If the Titan was bound by a vow and not just by chains, then a broken vow could become a weapon, and he wanted to be the one to use it. Then the Wraith army came back into motion. Pale humanoid shapes slipped through the cracks around the chamber, thin gray bodies drifting forward with black mist around their limbs. Their broken faces turned at once toward the light of Gideon's lantern and toward the royal birthmark hidden near Eira's collarbone, as if some invisible scent had reached them. Their hunger was clear, though they made no sound. Gideon lifted the lantern higher, and the pale flame flared as the shadow mist recoiled. Mara moved to Eira's side in one quick step, her posture low and ready, and she used the broken stones of the chamber floor to keep the spirits from surrounding them. Victor, on the far side of the room, did not flee. He had expected this, and that was the second frightening truth. He had led the wraiths here by disturbing old seals along the route from the outer ruins because he wanted the chamber to weaken before he entered. He believed the spirits would attack anyone with royal blood, and he intended to force Eira into opening the prison for him. The chamber filled with motion as the wraiths rushed, then stalled in the lantern light, then lunged again from the darker edges. One spirit struck the boundary of Gideon's pale flame and broke apart into smoke that rolled back across the floor. Another nearly reached Eira, but Mara drove it away with a hard swing of her staff and a sharp shout that echoed off the stone. No one was injured, but the pressure was rising fast, and the Titan began to strain against its chains as if every attack outside the vow made the prison weaker. Eira looked up at the Titan, then down at the sword, and she understood the terrible choice before her. If she kept fighting only to survive, the wraiths would keep coming and Victor would use the chaos. If she used the vow correctly, she might calm the Titan long enough to learn what was buried under the capital. But if she spoke the wrong words, or if Victor forced the seal open first, the chamber could break in ways no one could fix. The next answer came from the Titan itself. Its massive stone fingers shifted against the chains, and one of the broken iron pylons gave a loud crack as dust spilled from the floor. A deep rumble ran through the chamber, and the first king's memory finally awakened. Light rose from the Eclipse blade and spread across the floor in a thin ring, and within that ring the old memory appeared. It was the royal archivist memory of the first king, a stern man with short dark hair, a worn royal robe with muted gold trim, and a solemn face that seemed built from grief and duty. He stood in the Eclipse hall as if the past had opened a door. His voice was not proud and it was not cruel. It was tired. He said the prison had never been meant to last forever. It was only a holding place until the kingdom could face the thing under the cratered capital, a buried force that had once fed on fear, division, and royal pride. He had hidden the truth because he believed the people were not ready, and because he feared that the throne itself would be consumed by anyone who learned how to command the Titan. Then came the twist that changed Eira more than anything else. The memory turned its gaze toward her birthmark, and the first king revealed that the royal line had not been chosen to rule the prison. It had been chosen to keep the prison honest. The mark was not only a sign of blood, it was a seal of witness. Eira was never meant to command the Titan by force. She was meant to decide whether the kingdom would keep hiding or finally face the truth and rebuild it with open eyes. Victor heard that and stiffened because his whole plan depended on the opposite idea. He had built everything on the belief that power could be taken. Now he saw that the real power belonged to trust, memory, and choice. Eira felt the weight of that truth settle into her chest, heavy but clear. She had come into Veilwatch thinking she might find a weapon or a lost line or a way to save people from a doomed kingdom. Instead, she found a chain of choices made by frightened rulers, broken defenders, and one young woman who had spent too long believing she had to stand alone. The Titan began to calm as she lowered the Eclipse blade and spoke the vow again, this time with full understanding. She did not ask for control, she asked for truth. The black chains shivered, then stopped shaking as if the prison itself had decided to listen. Gideon held the lantern steady, his face hard with relief, and Mara stepped closer, ready to trust Eira even though she still did not trust the chamber. Victor moved at last because he knew he was losing his chance. He raised his hand and sent the wraiths forward in one sharp wave, hoping to break the room before the vow could settle fully. The spirits rushed in a long white blur, but the lantern flame flared brighter than before, the Eclipse blade shone with cold light, and the Titan lifted one massive arm enough to block the central path. Stones scraped against stone. The chamber shook, dust poured from the ceiling, yet the prison did not fall. Instead, a hidden seam opened in the floor beneath the Titan, and a spiral stairway began to appear, dropping into darkness below the throne room depths. Eira stared at the opening because it meant the true heart of Veilwatch was still deeper than she had guessed, and whatever lay below had been waiting for her from the start. Victor saw the stairway too, and for the first time his calm face cracked into open anger. He had lost the chamber, but he had not yet lost the kingdom. As the wraiths pulled back and Gideon called for everyone to move, Eira stepped toward the new opening with the Eclipse blade in her hand and the first king's truth in her mind. She was no longer just searching for answers. She was walking into the buried heart of Veilwatch, and the next secret would decide whether the fallen kingdom could rise again, or whether its deepest prison had only just begun to wake. The hidden passage opened into a vast chamber under Veilwatch, where broken stone walls curved around a deep silence and cold ash covered the floor. Eira stepped forward first, her silver-white hair tied back, her gray-blue eyes fixed on the dark center ahead. Gideon stayed close behind with his temple lantern because the pale flame could weaken shadow mist, and Mara moved at his side, ready for anything and trusting almost nothing. They soon found the truth of the place. The chamber was not a treasure room, but the buried heart of the kingdom, built to hold something too dangerous for open sky. In the center stood the Titan of the Western Plain, a giant of cracked stone with glowing rune marks and black chains pulled tight around its body. Thick iron pylons held those chains in place, and one pylon had been broken loose, which was why the wraiths had started gathering near the surface. They were drawn to royal blood, and Eira now understood the terrible reason. The first king had used her bloodline as the lock, because only true heirs could awaken or seal the prison below. Then Victor appeared on a shattered ledge above them, his gray hair neat, his black coat calm, and his silver eyes colder than the stone around him. He wanted the prison open because he believed the Titan carried an ancient source of power that could make him rule what remained of Veilwatch. He had not come to destroy the kingdom, he had come to own its last weapon. That truth hit harder than any blade, because greed had kept this ruin alive for generations, and greed was now standing in the chamber with them. Eira raised the Eclipse blade, and the sword answered with thin eclipse lines and a cold, sharp glow. The first king memory rose from the blade like a living vision, showing that the prison was not a cage for the Titan alone. It also trapped the wraith source beneath the capital, and if Victor forced it open, the hollow army would spread beyond Veilwatch and swallow the land in endless shadow. Eira finally understood that she had never been chosen to take power. She had been chosen to carry responsibility. So she stepped to the broken iron pylon, placed the blade into the rune slot, and let her royal blood awaken the seal. The Titan groaned once, then went still as the chains tightened and the wraith mist broke apart. Victor lunged forward in rage, but Gideon and Mara drove him back long enough for the chamber to collapse shut around the prison. When the dust settled, the ruins were quiet again, and Eira stood changed. She was no longer searching for her place in Veilwatch. She had become the one who protected its future, and the fallen kingdom finally had a chance to rise in the light again.